Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back to the 131st episode of the Athletes Podcast featuring Andrew Maraniss, a New York Times bestselling author who we had the pleasure to chat with for 50 minutes. And I could not have been more thrilled with how the conversation went. We probably could have chatted for 4 to 5 hours. The guy has so much knowledge, has done years of research. He's got 4 books out. The first being Strong Inside, a biography of Perry Wallace, who was the first African-American basketball player in the Southeastern Conference, was actually the first sports-related book to ever receive 2 prestigious Civil Rights Books Awards. The second being Games of Deception, the true story of the first U.S. Olympic basketball team at the 1936 Olympics in Nazi Germany. The third that we discussed very briefly was Singled Out, a biography on Glenn Burke, the first openly gay Major League Baseball player. And then fourth, the reason for our conversation today, was Inaugural Ballers, the beginnings of Olympic women's basketball, specifically the 1976 U.S. Olympic team, where we dive into this book that goes live in September. You can pre-order it now. It's really a combination of A League of Their Own meeting Miracle. It's an inspirational true story of the first U.S. Olympic women's basketball team and their unlikely rise to the top. Jordan, what did you think of the conversation?
First and foremost, listening to it for 10 minutes, you sit there and realize, wow, this guy knows a lot about basketball. But not only that, you could tell like everything you brought up, he was getting like giddy over it, right? So when you and him discussed the 1976 Olympics, like you can tell, you know, when you were speaking, he just like, he wanted to add to it. He wanted to inform us about it. And he told us the stories between the 1976 Olympics and the first Olympics for men, which was 1936. There we go. 40-year difference, right? And, you know, talking about how James Naismith was there to watch, you know, his sport he created in action actually under an Olympic event, even going into detail about the championship game being played in the rain there. He had a ton of great stories, and something that you just kind of sit there and you just forget, you know, it was 45 minutes. He made it super interesting, and you just learn a ton about things I just never knew about.
Right. And I feel like doing research on this conversation today, it was fascinating for me to be able to listen in to some of the conversations that he's had. Obviously, you can do your own research outside of this podcast, but we appreciate you tuning in, listening. The world of sport has been pretty crazy over the past couple of weeks. We had a couple different female executives in the hockey world get promoted. The first, Hayley Wickenheiser, assistant GM to your Leafs.
Hey, you know what? I think when you read that title, it sounds amazing because it's Dr. Hayley Wickenheiser, and now the assistant GM of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Like, we've discussed her in an intro before in our podcast, and she's just an amazing human being who clearly does everything. And yeah, I couldn't be more excited to have her as the assistant general manager for the Toronto Maple Leafs. She's
someone who will eventually get on the show at some point, I'm sure. Jessica Campbell was also promoted to the head coach of the Seattle Kraken's farm team in the AHL, the Coachella Valley Firebirds.
Yeah, the first ever female ever to do it in the AHL. It's definitely, we're finally, you know, making progress in the world of sports in this, and I'm excited to see what she does next season.
This all occurring on the 50th anniversary of Title IX this year. A lot of things starting to, like you said, making progress in the world of sport. Mike Greer just signed as the San Jose Sharks general manager, first black GM in the NHL, 100-year plus history. These things are happening more and more. And the best part was the fact that we were able to have these conversations with Andrew today and really dive into the impact.
Oh my gosh, yeah, like especially how he discussed Perry Wallace and the life he lived. And, you know, I know that we probably knew it through Jackie Robinson, especially because there was a movie released on it too, but it wasn't great. And like what these people did just to place their sport that they loved is unbelievable. I couldn't imagine it.
Mm-hmm. You'll hear it more in the episode too, where we dive into the fact that, you know, he was the reason that Andrew was actually in this Black History class 20 years later at Vanderbilt studying. It actually inspired him to go reach out, start doing this research for 8+ years to write this book. Just a crazy all-around story. Andrew's a phenomenal human being who I'm very fortunate to have had this conversation with, and I look forward to meeting in the future as we travel down to the U.S., head through Nashville. We're making a point of stopping in. He's also mentioned the fact that he's going to have more books coming out in the future. One likely on LeBron James, who I had to bring up today because I'm going to make a prediction here on the Athletes Podcast, episode 131. I think LeBron James is going to go full Jackie Moon from the Flint Tropics on us. He is going to bring an NBA team to Las Vegas. I'm calling it here now because of his 2% stake in Liverpool, thanks to his contract with Fenway Sports Group. The stars are aligning here. Joe Pompliano wrote an article on it, posted a bunch of tweets basically outlining why he thinks it's going to happen. It makes perfect sense. But I think I'm going to take it a step further. Like I said, he's going full Jackie Moon on us, and he's going to be player, coach, GM.
He's doing it all in the world of sport.
Legitimately, I think that LeBron is the kind of guy that is willing to do whatever it takes. And I think if he's able to manage that team, play on that team, pull his son to that team,
nothing can stop the guy, I guess. You know what? You're kind of also sounding like I don't know if you've ever seen Ballers, but that's what The Rock did. And I think at the end of season 2 or 3, he's like announcing in one of the stadiums, like, yeah, I'm bringing a team to Las Vegas. So, LeBron James is doing it in real life now. So
I'm just saying he knows what he's doing. He's making chess moves when we're all playing checkers.
Yeah.
His 2% stake in Liverpool was initially worth $6.5 million, but with Liverpool's valuation increasing from $500 million to $4.5 billion, it is now valued at $90 million.
Cool.
He had an $83.5 million increase in that stake since signing with FSG. So
in a world where everyone's most likely, not everyone I shouldn't say, but a lot of people are seeing their stocks go down, this guy's is only rising. So good for him.
He also transferred that 2% ownership stake in Liverpool to a 1% stake in the parent company. Mm-hmm. So this has made him a co-owner of all FSG assets, that being the Red Sox, Liverpool, and the rest of the sporting entities that they own. I'm just calling it here first. I think it's going to happen. It'll be an incredible story. I hope that Andrew is able to write about this at some point. I think the stars are aligning and it makes sense. And I wanted to make sure that everyone on the Athletes Podcast knew that we're
making the bold prediction here.
Yeah. We're making bold predictions.
We have to.
I'd love for you folks to drop a comment as to what you think is going to happen, because the world of sport is crazy, and I love making predictions. Looking back 10 years later, what's going to happen? Maybe we'll be referring to you on one of these episodes in the future. Mm-hmm. Without further ado, Jordan, I think we got to get to this episode.
Yeah, let's bring it home.
Andrew Maraniss, the guy's a legend, written about legends.
And now everyone here gets to listen about it, so here we go.
I love it when you are able to have things go the way they should. And we are so grateful today to be talking with Andrew Maraniss. I want to make sure I'm saying that right before I also say. Did I say? I did? Nice. Look at that. Gotta love it. First try. Andrew Maraniss, who's a New York Times bestselling author and a visiting author at Vanderbilt University Athletics, an author of numerous books, an incredible human being who's written on some sensitive subjects, to say the least. And he's coming out with his new novel this year, Inaugural Ballers, based on the 1976 USA women's basketball team. Andrew, thank you so much for coming on the Athletes Podcast. I'm honored to have you on the show and super excited to chat with you today about everything that you've done in your illustrious career, because it's pretty phenomenal. Let's first just dive into this new book and what you're doing here specifically. And then, like I mentioned previously before we started recording, that I'm going to peel back some layers to the onion here and find out exactly who Andrew Maraniss is and all of the amazing things that you've done, because it's not just this one book that comes out here in August, but I'll let you divulge more information on the book, what inspired it, and we'll go from there.
This way to get to the subject of this book, Inaugural Ballers, talk very briefly about my other books, and we can come back to those. But my first book was called Strong Inside, and it's a biography of Perry Wallace, who was the first Black basketball player in the SEC, the Southeastern Conference. That's the league that has schools like Alabama, Georgia, Florida, LSU, Mississippi, the deep South of the United States. And so in writing that book, I really came to realize, even more than I knew heading into that book, how much I enjoyed telling stories that involve true stories involving sports and history and social issues, and so that book became more about racism and what it was like to be an African-American teenager in the Deep South in the 1960s, as much about those issues and the toll of pioneering than about basketball, right? And so after that book had been out for about a year and a half, I adapted it for kids and created a version for middle school and high school students. And that showed me that there were a whole lot of kids out there that maybe loved sports, but didn't really spend a whole lot of time in their school library, or didn't really realize that there were books out there that they would be interested in. And so I decided to kind of turn my career to writing for young people, but also writing the books in a style that adults would like too. But in terms of generating interest from teenagers, keep the story moving quickly, have photos, have cliffhangers at the end of every chapter to get them to turn that page, to stay involved in the book. And so my second book, Games of Deception, was the true story of the first U.S. men's Olympic basketball team, which played at the 1936 Olympics in Nazi Germany. And so that's a book that deals with basketball, but also with anti-Semitism and fascism. And for your Canadian listeners, Canada won the silver medal in those Olympics. And James Naismith, the Canadian who invented basketball, was there to see his sport played in the Olympics. My third book is called Singled Out. It's a biography of Glenn Burke, who's considered the first openly gay Major League Baseball player. And then we come to Inaugural Ballers, which comes out on September 13th. And the literal answer to how I came to write this book is I was in a school in Kansas, and a girl in the crowd was hearing me talk about this first men's Olympic basketball team. And she said, well, what about the first women's Olympic basketball team from the US? And so when she mentioned that, I had been wanting to do a story involving women's sports anyway. And that just really was like, of course, that's what I should do. And so I spent about a year and a half working on it. And again, the book will come out just here in a few weeks. And I'm really thrilled about it and happy to talk more about some of the interesting characters and the themes. But it's really set a story that is set in the context of the women's rights movement of the early 1970s. And again, trying to put the sports story into the context of the times that these characters existed.
So let's start with the context of these times. 1976 Olympic Games held in Montreal, Canada as well. The U.S. team had actually yet to qualify for these games prior to that. And they actually had to go travel to Hamilton alongside 22 other countries to qualify. They were one of two teams, I believe Hungary was the other that made it. I can't remember off the top of my head. Anyway, a lot of pressure would have been on this team. What was it that allowed them to see success and ultimately create this movement?
Right. So yes, put the basketball part of this story into context. Now the U.S. women's national basketball team never even loses a game hardly. They've won the gold medal in 7 straight Olympics without hardly losing a game. But back in 1976, we're one of the worst teams in the world, really, leading up to the Olympics in terms of how they had finished in the World Championships the year before, 8th place, not qualifying for the Olympic tournament. Like you said, there was one last chance for 2 teams to qualify for the Olympics in Hamilton, Ontario, leading up to the Montreal Games. And the U.S. happened to play well at that tournament. And so they make it to the Olympics, but still really have no realistic chance of winning the gold medal. The Soviet team was by far the best team in the world at that point. And talk about hardly losing a game. I think they were undefeated for the last 10 years heading into those Olympics and international play. They had 2 interesting players. I think one was their center, Semenova, who was over 7 feet tall and was essentially unstoppable when she got the ball near the basket. And they also had Alex Ovechkin's mom was a player on that team, great hockey player. And so they were really the class of international basketball at that time. Were expected to win the gold medal and did in dominating fashion. But one thing that was interesting about that tournament is they played purely a round robin. So there was no championship game, and now when you win the silver medal, it's usually that you've lost the gold medal game and settle for the silver. Back then, there wasn't a gold medal game. It was just, how did you do in all of your games in this round robin tournament? And so the American women's team knew that if they won their final game, that would win them the silver medal. So they actually won a game, and we're celebrating that to win the silver. I also interviewed players from the Canadian team, and one thing I have noticed, and I mean everyone notices, that Americans typically act like we're the center of the world, right? And so for readers of this book, I wanted to give a sense of what things were like in Canada at the time in terms of comparing women's rights in the United States and in Canada. Also, what was the story about the Canadian women's team that was the host country at these Olympics? And so, I weave their story into the book as well.
Yeah, it was phenomenal. I had the chance to give it a read prior to this conversation. And actually, at the end of chapter 2, there was a part specifically stuck out to me. It said, when Billy Moore's team arrived in Montreal in the summer of 1976, they hadn't just overcome a series of opponents on the basketball court to reach the game's summit. They had climbed a mountain composed of nearly a century's worth of misogyny and obstruction. And it was a specific part there that just stood out to me, because it wasn't just one basketball game. It wasn't about basketball at all. It was really creating this movement that was able to come to fruition and ultimately led to the rise of basketball in the United States, specifically in female sports, like directly correlated, I'm pretty sure. And you can probably speak to this a bit more accurately than I can.
You mentioned, thank you for mentioning it, was meant to refer in specific ways to all of the sort of restrictions and attacks on women's sports over the years, but also just women's rights and feminism in general, and all that had to be overcome to reach this point. So in terms of basketball, there had been many efforts over the years to really diminish women's basketball here and in other parts of the world. But, in talking about it in the United States, I mean, basketball would become very popular with women. And then you would see people pushing back on it and saying that it was unfeminine, or unladylike. You shouldn't have women out there on the court sweating, and fighting for rebounds and being physical on the court, that men shouldn't be watching that, that was some perversion even to men being there watching the game, that women were supposed to, look pretty and serve the needs of men and not be pursuing their own interests that might involve athletics, to the point that schools were canceling their women's basketball programs at different points in history, especially when they became good. And there was attention being paid to those teams, to the point that girls were told by their parents, well, it was okay for you to play as a little girl, but now that you're in middle school or high school, you really shouldn't be playing sports anymore. And you certainly shouldn't be beating a boy, even in a playground foot race, that would be damaging to his ego, and then that's not a proper thing for a young lady to do. And so just the idea that these women in 1976, whether they're on the Canadian team or the American team, were even playing, that what they had overcome quite a bit, a lot of schoolyard taunting, a lot of disapproval from their friends and from their family members, even with very little support, very little budget in terms of, there were some players on the American Olympic team who had to sew their numbers on their own jerseys for their college teams, or when they would go play a road trip, they wouldn't stay in a hotel. They would sleep on a mat on the floor of the visiting teams or the home team's gymnasium, just things that we would not think were possible today in terms of the lack of support that they had. And so that's what I was trying to express in that brief line in chapter 2. And then I go back and explain in more detail all the hurdles they had to overcome sociologically and in terms of sports.
It's such a shame that it took as long as it did. And we're still seeing this to this day, despite Title IX and these things being put in place. It's, again, I heard Billy Moore quote saying that until the WNBA gets to a point where games, you can't just show up to the game and get in right away. That's when we'll know we've made a significant difference in that women's sport is at the same level. But it was really interesting the way you put it, in that this book is really a combination of A League of Their Own meeting Miracle in this inspirational story. And it's so true, because Miracle is one of those movies that I could watch every single day. Just the story behind it, you get goosebumps. And A League of Their Own, I grew up watching with my mom, and I just have such fond memories of that movie. So it was so incredible, and I'm so grateful to be able to share this with our listeners and viewers wherever they're consuming the content. But this is also 20 years before women's soccer became an Olympic sport, and 2 decades before the formation of the WNBA. So they really laid the foundation for the incredible rise of women's sports in America at the youth level, collegiate, Olympic, and professional level. So it's really an incredible story to be able to pull out some details from you today. But I'd love to see also what your thoughts are, because in your second book, Games of Deception, where it's talking about the first U.S. Olympic basketball team at the 1936 Olympics, there's still, 40 years between those two Olympic Games. And can you speak to the change that occurred that you saw between those 40 years based on the research that you did, and then maybe how the 76 games were instrumental to see success over the next 40 years for women?
Yeah. So, I mean, what I think is especially just fascinating about the 36 Olympics, like I mentioned earlier, is that the inventor of this entire sport was able to be there,
Yeah.
So it shows what a short period of time really there was in the game's development at that point, that the inventor was still alive, right? So James Naismith was there. He really saw the 36 Olympics as a chance to introduce basketball to the world. It really wasn't played that much in Europe at that time. The North American teams were the best teams in the world. U.S. winning the gold, Canada winning the silver, and Mexico winning the bronze medal. And I don't think Canada or Mexico has won a medal in Olympic men's basketball since the 36 Olympics. So they were really the teams that were teaching the rest of the world how to play at that point. Basketball was thought of so little in Germany in 1936 that they played the entire tournament outside on clay tennis courts that had been converted into basketball courts. And that worked out okay for the first few rounds. And most people, play shoot around outside. It wasn't that unusual. But to play, the best tournament in the world outside on a clay tennis court, and it turned into a disaster in the medal round where it was pouring rain. And you had players from the US and Canada saying, hey, can we move this game inside to a gym? And the Olympic organizers said, well, we play soccer outside in the rain. You can play basketball outside in the rain. And so that gold medal game was considered really a joke of a game by players on both the American and the Canadian teams. But we fast forward 40 years later. So the Soviet Union had been lobbying for women's basketball to be included in the Olympics dating back to the 1950s. And they had the best team in the world. It was to their, advantage to have it become an Olympic sport and to prove they were the best in the world. It kept getting shot down. There were IOC members who generally were really against women's sports even being in the Olympics, period. And then they thought that if women were going to be competing in the Olympics, they should be competing in sports that they considered more feminine, like gymnastics or diving, not a team sport that had some element of physicality to it, like basketball. And as you mentioned, this was before there was women's Olympic soccer. It was before there was a women's Olympic World Cup, women's soccer World Cup. And so I feel like it was basketball that really put women's team sports on the map first. There's not as much talk about this 1976 Olympic basketball team. I think today in America, if you talked about what's the women's national team that really is the face of women's team sports, it would be the soccer team, and for good reason. They've performed really well. They've been very active on social issues and, gender equality and equal pay and things like that. But really, I feel that they stand on the shoulders of these 76 Olympians as well, who had overcome so much as individuals to even get to that point with no promise of any reward in the future. There was no WNBA, like you said, coming along 20 years after these Olympics. And so they weren't competing for endorsements or the possibility of a future professional career. They hadn't even received scholarships to play in college for the most part. And so there's a tendency to say that they were only playing for the love of the game at that point, which in some ways is true. But in some ways, I think romanticizes that era to a degree that we shouldn't, and to say, we shouldn't say that that was a pure era and that by comparison, there's something wrong with women today who are playing for scholarships, who are playing for money and professionally. The women in the 70s deserved more than they were getting. They didn't get it, but they laid the groundwork for women to benefit in the future. And I think when you hear women professional athletes today talk about, why they do speak up on social issues or do speak up on pay issues, it's for the benefit of girls and women in the future. And so you've seen that all along through the decades of women accomplishing certain things for themselves, but also knowing that they were doing things that would benefit future generations.
Yeah, and I'm curious if they were aware of the impact that they would have had, and I'm sure they were to some degree. But it's tough to imagine or fathom even whether they could comprehend what they were able to accomplish during that time. I'm curious how they were able to select these teams, given that there weren't national teams going on. Like, how were they selected? Do you know what went into that process? Was it kind of where you were going to school and by luck of the draw, who knew about you? Or
it's a good question. So there was a U.S. national team that had played in some international tournaments in the years leading up to the Olympics, the World University Games, the World Championships, the Pan American Games. And so there was a system in place to have a national team. But as you're getting to, there wasn't really a good funnel system to yield the players that would even try out for those teams. There was no, in the US, it's NCAA college basketball sort of would be where you would draw players from in the future. In 76, the NCAA didn't even administer women's sports. There was what was known as the AIAW, which was only for women's athletics, but that organization didn't believe in scholarships. And so there wasn't a college scholarship model like there is now in the United States. And so you had women who were, quote unquote, regular students, or maybe be recruited to play basketball at a school, but really for no financial gain, just to be on the team. There were even high school players that were considered, top players that were on the team. So Nancy Lieberman on the 76 team for the US, she was still in high school. You had former college players who didn't really have a professional basketball opportunity, but maybe were in coaching. So Pat Head, who becomes Pat Summitt, one of the all-time greatest women's basketball coaches in history, the coach at University of Tennessee, she was already coaching at Tennessee when she was a player on the 76 Olympic team. You had another woman named Julianne Simpson who went to school at John F. Kennedy College in Wahoo, Nebraska. Everyone's heard of John F. Kennedy. I don't know anyone who's heard of John F. Kennedy College. It doesn't even exist anymore. It existed for 10 years in this little town of Wahoo, Nebraska. So they were drawing players from many different circumstances, very different than you would have today, where players are so well known from their AAU days, leading up to them playing in college and then in the WNBA, of course, with professional athletes playing now. So it was quite a process to identify these players. They ended up having tryout camps around the country, and the best players from those camps were sent to Warrensburg, Missouri, to a small college there where they had the final tryouts.
Incredible. That second book of yours, Games of Deception, I just wanted to highlight the fact that it also received the Sidney Taylor Book Honor and was named one of Amazon's top books in 2019. So for those listening, do check it out. We'll make sure that it's in the show notes down below. But I'm really trying to wrap my head around your story, because you spent 25 years in public relations before writing books and returning to Vanderbilt. You served as the media relations manager for the Tampa Bay Devil Rays. You've been involved, and that was during their inaugural season in 1998 also, just wanted to note. Spent 5 years as associate director of media relations at Vanderbilt University Athletic Department, graduated from Vanderbilt in 92. Incredible story. You received a Grantland Rice sports writing scholarship specifically as well. Like, what led you down this path? I know that your father was a writer who also had a great name by the name of David Maraniss, who is a Pulitzer Prize winner, one of the best of the Washington Times, author of biographies for Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Vince Lombardi, just to name a few.
I want to make sure it's the Washington Post rather than the Washington Times.
We'll put in the Washington Post. My apologies. But was this just something that was ingrained at a young age to start writing, doing research on these things? What for you was that spark moment that allowed you to start writing?
Yeah, well, writing has always been a part of me and my family, and sports too, so I feel like I'm getting to do what I've always enjoyed. I learned how to read by reading the back of baseball cards. My grandfather bought me my first set of cards when I was 4 or 5 years old, and I would just study those cards every day. When I was 13, I started my own little sports magazine where I wrote about my favorite teams, the Brewers and the Packers. I'm originally from Wisconsin.
Okay.
And I interviewed John Feinstein, who you probably know, one of the best-selling sports authors of all time. He was a work colleague of my dad's at the Washington Post at the time, and I interviewed him for a magazine, and it lasted one issue. Nobody bought it. So, and then when I was in high school, we had moved to Texas, and I was a sports editor of my high school paper and played on the baseball team. And I applied for that sports writing scholarship you mentioned to Vandy, and I was lucky enough to win it. And that's why I ended up coming to Nashville to go to college. So sports and writing always been a part of, who I consider myself. And then when I was in college, my sophomore year is when I learned about this man named Perry Wallace, who had been the Jackie Robinson figure of Southern collegiate sports. And he had gone to my school, Vanderbilt, but I didn't grow up here in Nashville. I didn't know much of the history of the school or the sports teams here. And when I heard that the first Black player in the entire conference had gone to my school, I was really interested in learning more about him. And I was taking a Black history class at that time. And I wanted to write a paper about Perry for my class, but I was really concerned that my professor was going to say, we don't write about sports in college. We don't write about basketball players. That's not serious enough subject. And thankfully, she didn't say that at all. She said, if that's what you're interested in, that's what you should do. And so I wrote a paper about Perry Wallace's experience that I came back to 17 years later to write the book. And getting to know Perry and spending so much time with him, it took me 8 years to write the book, really gave me such a deeper understanding of racism, deeper understanding of what it takes to be a pioneer, what it takes out of the person who is a pioneer, how mentally and physically draining that is. And it also showed me, if you want to write about these subjects that deal with important social issues, that really needs to become a part of who you are at a much deeper level, and not to just parachute in and write a story about racism or write a story about homophobia in my third book, Singled Out, or write a story about sexism and women's rights and then move on to something else. Like, you're going to take on these topics that really should be a part of deep part of who you are and what you're all about every day. And so writing these books has given me a greater sense of purpose in life and responsibility to live up to the types of people that I've written about.
Well, you've done an incredible job in doing so. So thank you for doing that. I'm also want to clarify, was Perry not the reason that class existed at Vanderbilt?
Yes, in some ways he was. So you're talking about the Black history class that I was taking, when Perry was more than just a pioneering basketball player. He was a pioneering student at Vanderbilt also, which, being located in Nashville in the South, was a segregated school, did not admit its first Black students until the fall of 1964. Perry comes along just 2 years later, and he's one of the first Black students really on this campus, and was more than a basketball player. I mean, he was speaking out about what he saw on this campus and trying to help the administration learn about its Black students and what was required to make it a hospitable place for them, and also what was lacking from the education that Vanderbilt students were receiving. In part, one of the things they were lacking was Black history. And so he and some of his classmates pushed the administration to hire African-American professors. There were none at the time they arrived on school, and to add these classes. And so, yeah, the class existed 20 years later when I was a student. Had no idea that Perry was partially responsible for that, but so thankful that he was. But interesting full circle moment. And then to really bring it full circle, Perry was still living when my book came out, but he has since passed away. Mm-hmm. And I was fortunate to be able to sit with him about a week before he died at a hospice facility in Maryland. And at that time, I was, sort of going through all of his career accomplishments. He was an incredible man. He became a law professor after basketball. He sang opera, was a black belt in karate, he spoke fluent French, and one of the things he said was that he wanted us to plan his memorial service for him on the Vanderbilt campus. And when you think about the racism that he endured on this campus, the fact that he wanted his service to take place here really represented the healing and the reconciliation that had finally occurred late in his life. And it was very touching to me.
Yeah, I think incredible man would have almost been an understatement. Like, he helped Pearl High School's basketball team go undefeated and win the team's first integrated basketball state championship. Was a straight A student, valedictorian of his class, named high school All-American athlete. 2003 Tennessee Sports Hall of Fame. 2017 there was a movie made called The Untold Story of Perry Wallace. 2021, the United States Basketball Writers Association renamed the men's version of its annual award for courage among figures associated with college basketball as the Perry Wallace Most Courageous Award. Simply incredible what this man was able to do. Again, while earning his JD from Columbia in 1975, like, you name it, he seemed to be able to do it. You had to interview 80 people over 4 years in preparation for this book. What did you learn about Perry during that time outside of, because he even said, to his point, he said, you knew him better than he knew himself. Well, I gotta, compete with a guy who does research for a living. So,
I mean, the things I learned about Perry we could spend like a week talking about it. I felt like the luckiest person to have him sort of serve as a father type figure to me, a professor type of figure. When you're writing a biography about someone, you don't want to just write a hagiography and only praise this person you're writing about. But I never found a single negative thing that anyone had to say about Perry. He's just a remarkable person. What I'll say about Perry is a couple quotes that have always stuck with me. When he was being recruited to play college basketball, one of his goals was to get out of the South, get out of the segregated part of the country that he had grown up in. And so he was recruited by schools in the Big Ten, like Michigan and Wisconsin and Purdue, Iowa, Northwestern. He was recruited by UCLA, which had the best team in the country at that time. And he thought this was his dream come true, but until he took these trips and he would see the ugly side of American college sports, where he was offered cars and offered cash and offered houses and things, which are all illegal. And then he was also told, if you come to our school, you don't really have to go to class. We'll make sure you're eligible, or we'll just find the easiest classes for you. Don't worry about anything except basketball. And that was really offensive to Perry, who was a serious student and wanted a real education. And how he described that situation to me is, he said he wasn't going to trade one plantation for another. And Perry was an engineering student, but I considered him a poet too, and to say he wasn't going to trade one plantation for another, what he meant was he wasn't going to leave the Deep South, where he wasn't treated as a full human being, just to go to one of these schools that really wanted to just exploit him for his athletic ability. They only cared he was 6'5" and he could jump, didn't care about his intellectual abilities. Another thing he said is after his last game as a senior, he talked to the athletic director at Vanderbilt what his experience had been like. Was telling the truth about the racism he encountered, the loneliness that he felt on campus. And the athletic director said, well, Perry, you've got to understand what we don't need is protest. What we do need is law and order, and was trying to shut Perry down from speaking his mind. And Perry said, yes, any society needs law and order, but it also needs justice. And racism doesn't amount to justice. And the athletic director said, well, if it's that bad, why didn't you leave? As if that was the proper response. And Perry said, it's not my job to get up and leave a school that claims to, in a country, that claims to have justice. I belong here just like anybody else. And there's so much symbolism wrapped into what Perry was saying beyond just Vanderbilt, but about this whole country. And you see echoes of that today, where it seems like our country is really backsliding on so many important social gains over the last 40 years that people like Perry Wallace fought for. And that's where I'm saying, that this experience of writing the book didn't just end after the 8 years of researching and writing it, or end after it came out. It lives with me today and gives me a purpose in fighting back against some of the the repressive, almost fascist sort of elements of this country.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you're doing it. I'll be frank, because there needs to be more people like you that are bringing light to these situations and showcasing what these incredible people are doing, despite what is going on. And I also have to just give a little context here for those who don't know. An example of just a very minor showcase of what racism he had to deal with. First year against Ole Miss as a freshman, they just canceled the game outright. As a sophomore, they go in, they play the game. He's struck in the face, blinded in his right eye, basically, sent back to the dressing room. It wasn't even stopped during this play, if I recall correctly, and then comes back into the second half and completely dominates the game. But this is just like one of the many situations that I'm sure he had to face on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. And, I'm sure you have probably some horrific stories. As to whether or not you want to share them, I'll leave that up to you. But I just can't even wrap my head around what he had to go through to play that sport and ultimately to do the things that he was able to accomplish.
Yeah, well, two things about that story. You're right. So Perry's freshman year, University of Mississippi wouldn't even play against a team that had a black player. So his sophomore year is when he goes down to Oxford, Mississippi, and plays in that game where he's bloodied and the fans are cheering the fact that he's injured. But what Perry told me about that experience was the most difficult part of that whole scene was at halftime, where he's sitting on the training table with a bag of ice on his eye, and there's a clock in the locker room, and it lets the team know when it's about time to start the second half. So that clock is ticking down. And as it gets close to zero, everybody else associated with the team runs back on the court. The coaches, the players, the student managers, and they leave Perry back there by himself. And he knows he's going to have to walk back into this hostile environment alone. And that it really showed what little empathy the rest of the team and coaches had for Perry at that moment. And that they had really put themselves in his shoes. At least one person would have waited with him and walked back onto the court with him to show the crowd, like, we've got our teammates back. And so that really illustrates another quote that Perry had. And he said that in life, we can all be treated in one of three ways by other people. We can be treated well by other people, we can be treated poorly by other people, or we cannot be treated at all. We can be ignored, And so Perry said that people always expect him to say that the most difficult part of his experience were the moments where he was not treated well, like where he's being physically harmed on the basketball court or verbally harassed by fans at games. But what he said is the most difficult part of his experience was that third way, the idea of not being treated at all. So essentially being ignored by his teammates in that situation, or on his own campus, where he wasn't treated as an equal person, as an equal student, where no white students would sit in the same row of class with him. Or you show up for your chemistry class and whoever sits next to you is supposed to be your lab partner for that day's experiments. But what if you are sitting there, as he and other Black students did, and they look, and as the other students walk in the classroom, nobody chooses to sit next to them, you know, and just that feeling in the pit of your stomach of that isolation and loneliness. And he said that was the most difficult part. And I think that was so profound, because I think a lot of us can relate to that. You know, we've all been treated well by other people. We've been treated poorly by other people, but that sense of not even mattering, I think really can be the most painful part. For me, it was being a new student, you know, so our family moved around a lot. And I was a new kid at school several times over the years. And I remember that feeling of showing up, you know, for lunch and really not having anybody to sit next to, you know, and just feeling like you were invisible in those situations. And obviously 100 times worse for Perry, but it gave me a small sense of understanding what he was talking about and tried to convey that in the book.
Mm-hmm. I also read that Perry may have been the reason as to why dunking wasn't allowed in college at the time.
Yeah, so there was a stretch of about 10 years in the mid to late 60s and early 70s where the slam dunk was against the rules in college basketball. And it's often referred to as the Alcindor rule, as if it was only aimed at Lou Alcindor, you know, who became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who was dunking like crazy at UCLA. But Perry Wallace was a phenomenal dunker in high school. He was as a freshman in college at Vanderbilt as well. And a couple of his freshman games, he played against the University of Kentucky, where Adolph Rupp was the legendary head coach, who was also the head of the rules committee in college basketball. And in 1966, Kentucky lost a famous game. You were talking about movies earlier. I don't know if you've seen Glory Road, the movie about Texas Western, which had an all-Black starting five, beat Adolph Rupp's all-white Kentucky team in the 1966 NCAA championship game. They had a player named David Lattin, who was a terrific dunker, who had actually began his college career in Nashville. Perry Wallace learned how to dunk from David Lattin, and then he comes along and is dunking as a freshman against Kentucky. And in the off season before Perry's first year on the varsity, where he's about to play 2 games a year at least against Kentucky every season for the next 3 years, Adolph Rupp has the slam dunk outlawed. And so I think that Perry did have quite a bit to do with it. And Adolph Rupp represented sort of an old guard in college basketball at that time that resented the Black players who were coming into the game and changing the way it was played above the rim, you know. And so one way of limiting the excellence of these Black players was to take something away from them, to literally change the rules. And so they took away the slam dunk, which was so popular with players and with fans, and it wasn't brought back in college basketball until the 1970s.
Well, and the slam dunk still to this day is one of the most impactful moments in a basketball game. And I think Perry got the last laugh because his last basket playing professional basketball was a slam dunk, was it not?
Yeah, playing college basketball. So he waited until his last game, which was against Mississippi State. The state of Mississippi held a lot of significance to Perry, and so in the last minute of the game, he dunked it. The refs should have waved the basket off, but they didn't. They let it stand. And what Perry told me is that growing up in the South, there were these segregation laws that were laws, but they were unjust laws. And in playing college basketball, there was the no dunk rule, which was a rule, but it was an unjust rule. And so this was his form of protest on the way out, was to dunk the ball for his last college basket.
Well, it's certainly an incredible story. I encourage everyone to reach out, take in what you've written, because every single book that you have out there is incredible. And I don't say that lightly, put it that way. But yeah, Andrew, I feel like I could talk sports all day with you. When we are in Nashville, we are absolutely going to have to get together and have a couple beverages, whether they're adult ones or not, around just more stories that you can share. I wanted to end this episode by asking you, the way we wrap up every episode, asking our guests what their biggest piece of advice would be to the next generation of athletes, similar as to what you do, where your goal was to educate that next generation. We're really trying to do the same for athletes specifically. And that's whether you're participating in sport now, whether you're a parent of an athlete, whether you're a coach, whatever the case may be. And I wanted to end this with a little excerpt from your book that stated, "A basketball coach must choose her words carefully in a pregame speech, just enough motivation and not too much pressure." And I thought that was so profound, because there is a fine line to walk when it comes to motivating your team, getting them into the moment. And I feel like you've got decades of knowledge and experience from the most incredible athletes around the world. And I'd love for you to share the biggest piece of advice you have to share with that next generation.
Okay. Well, thank you, David. And I'm a father of a young athlete. My son is 9 years old. I just was with him at a baseball camp this morning. I mean, at his age, which I know your listeners are older, but I mean, I think it's important to keep the fun in sports. You know, I want him to enjoy it. You know, the chances that he'll ever get to play in college or professional are so small that he should always remember that it's a game, you know, and you strive to be excellent at it, but don't lose the fun. I'm someone that kind of burned out. I loved baseball, but by the time I was a senior in high school, it wasn't fun for me anymore. And I hope that that's never the case for him. I think that Perry Wallace, if he were speaking to athletes, would be impressing upon athletes to remember that their academics really is more important, you know. And people would always ask him, should college athletes be paid? He'd say, I don't care if they're paid or not. Are they getting a real education? That's what's most important. And then the thing I would say also is, increasingly we see what a huge platform athletes have. You know, people pay attention to what athletes have to say on issues. And this is, you know, relates to my books that are using sports as a way of talking about important issues. And I admire athletes who are willing to speak up for what they believe in. And it obviously comes with people who will agree with them and people who will disagree with them. And so I think that's a reason why some athletes choose not to speak out, is they'd rather not deal with the haters. They have enough pressure already just trying to perform a very difficult job as athletes. But I really think that just the way our society is right now and who people pay attention to, that athletes should take advantage of the fact that they have a platform and to speak out for people in need, to speak out on important issues, and to use that platform productively. I'm starting a series of books for even younger kids, like first and second graders, called Bigger Than Sports, which will be all about athletes who have done important humanitarian work. So the first two books, one is going to be about Maya Moore, a great women's basketball player who quit the WNBA at the prime of her career to help get a person out of jail, a man that was in jail for a crime he did not commit in prison. And she was successful in doing that. The second book's going to be about LeBron James and the work he's done in Akron, his hometown, and starting a school there, you know, for kids in the part of town that he grew up in. And so I want to showcase athletes are not perfect people. They make mistakes. I know I'm going to write a book about someone who's probably going to get arrested like a week after the book comes out. And so I'm not saying that athletes are role models in every way, but to shine a light on athletes who are using their platform to do good for other people. And so I'd say that's something, even if you're just a high school athlete, a college athlete, there's people that are looking up to you, and to always remember that and to use your opportunity. It's not going to last forever, but to use that opportunity while people are looking at you to spread the right messages and to try to change the world in the small ways that you can.
Andrew, thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge and insights today. Like I said, I could talk with you for hours. I'm sure this will be the first of many conversations. I look forward to hearing and seeing those new books come out. Your book, Inaugural Ballers, comes out in a couple weeks. We're so excited to be able to showcase and share this story with all of our listeners. Where can people find you on social media, on the interweb, as big as it is, to make sure that they can get all of your content?
All right, David, thank you. So you can go to my website. It has information about all the books, which is andrewmaraniss.com. Maraniss is Maraniss. So andrewmaraniss.com. And then I'm on Twitter. I'm a Milwaukee Brewers fan, so my Twitter handle is referring to the True Blue Brew Crew. It's True Blue 24, but no E's in it. So TRUBLU 24. And then on Instagram, I'm A Maraniss.
Amazing. Thank you so much for the continued work that you do. We are honored to be able to share a bit about your story and all of the incredible books that you've written. Thank you again so much. Really appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you, David. You mentioned coming down to Nashville. If that's ever the case, please look me up. And I'm someone that has been to Toronto that year with the Rays, and then also brought my family up there a couple of years ago for a Blue Jays game. Love that city. So next time I'm there, I'll look you up as well.
Amazing. I look forward to it. Thanks again, Andrew.
Thank you, folks, for tuning in to the 131st episode of the Athletes Podcast featuring Andrew Maraniss. The New York Times best-selling author did not disappoint. During this conversation between Perry Wallace stories, the Inaugural Ballers book that we were talking about today specifically, and the incredible insights that he shared over this 55-minute conversation, I can't thank Andrew enough for coming on the show, and I can't wait to see the other books that Andrew's able to produce along the way, because what he's been able to do here, shining light on these sensitive subjects, is unprecedented, and we can't thank him enough for doing the work that not many have done. For those who are interested in checking out more of his work, please refer to the show notes down below. Hit that like and subscribe button so that we can continue doing this and so that we can continue sharing more of Andrew's stories in the future. Really appreciate, again, you folks tuning in, listening, wherever you're consuming the Athletes Podcast content. Please share this with a friend if it helped you or it will help someone else. Thank you, folks, again. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye.